Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing The Geese and the Ghost by Anthony Phillips.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So let me open this video up by stating the following. The backstory for this album is entirely fascinating. There's so many different intricacies on it and there's so much to say about it, and in this review I'll try to recap most of it, but note to yourself that there's so many little stories that I've just omitted from this entire review because honestly I can't do it for this long. But next year when I think about creating bigger projects and maybe even some album documentaries, I think that this one will definitely be revisited, seeing as it has such a lovely story behind it. But for now, I highly encourage anyone who knows or doesn't even know this album to go ahead and check out its Wikipedia article. It's not that long and it has a lot of interesting bits in it, so you might as well want to go ahead and read it. Anyway, here's some of my favorite bits from this album. So yeah, today we are reviewing The Geese and the Ghost by Anthony Phillips. Now for some of you who might know the name and don't kind of remember who that is, or even if you don't know the name at all, I might as well recap it to you. Anthony Phillips is one of the founding members and the seminal guitarist for the band Genesis. Now Anthony, and the reason I'm calling him Anthony is because we're gonna talk about his brother later on, so it's kind of just confusing to call him Phillips, but Anthony was born at the end of 1951 in Cheshwick in England, and sometime during preparatory school, which would mean he was less than 13 years of age, he would form his first group, or I should call them a band, but it's mostly like a musical group at that age. And during one of their performances, he would actually sing and forget the lyrics for the song he was singing, which would lead to a pretty catastrophic performance, which would ultimately get him kicked out of the band. Pretty harsh if you ask me for just a bunch of children. And after that, Anthony would mostly give up on singing and instead focus on learning the guitar, which is an instrument which he actually mastered quite quickly. And in 1965, Anthony would start attending a school in Surrey, in which he would form a band alongside four of his other schoolmates, and that band would be called Anon, and one of those band members you might know as Mike Rutherford being the future bassist for Genesis. Now shortly after, in 1966, Anon would actually disband, and alongside it another school band would also go on to break up, and that band was called Garden Wall. And what happened the following is that the two bands basically merged into one another, creating a 5-man group consisting of Anthony Rutherford as well as a player called Tony Banks, Peter Gabriel, and drummer Chris Stewart. And together these guys would produce a demo tape which would be picked up by producer Jonathan King, who would decide to take him as his own and publish their first album and name them Genesis. And this first album, called From Genesis to Revelation, proved to be quite promising, and the band was touring it around, only being about 17 years of age at the time. Now during said tours, Anthony would actually start experiencing some pretty severe symptoms of stage fright as well as bronchial pneumonia, and consulting with his doctor, he would actually advise him to entirely quit from the band. But Anthony actually persisted, and he went in the studio to record the second album for the band called Trespass with them. But when the time came to tour that album, Anthony soon realized he wasn't gonna be able to do it, and he unfortunately had to leave the band entirely. But just to note, some of Anthony's influences were to be found on the third Genesis album, with him being one of the original composers for the seminal piece called The Musical Box from their third album, Nursery Crime. Now Anthony and the band themselves actually maintained a pretty close close and very good connection between them, even when a replacement guitarist called Steve Hackett was brought forth to replace him, and especially a good connection was kept between Anthony and Mike Rutherford. And in the following 10 days since leaving Genesis, Anthony would actually start composing pieces very much in the likes of Genesis pieces at the times, and he would name two of them as Which Way the Wind Blows and God If I Saw Her Now, but they were made to no actual purpose at the time and were just left as demo recordings. Now, having a lot of time with himself, Anthony would actually start re-listening to a lot of classical music, especially of the Finnish composer Jean Sibelius, and in that time he would actually experience a sort of an artistic revelation, realizing just how limited of an artist he actually was. So in a sheer act of learning, Anthony would actually start taking lessons in both classical guitar and piano, as well starting to learn orchestration and harmony at the London Guildhall School of Music and Drama. And top that off, he would also start tutoring pupils himself, which is known to be a very education endeavor as its own. Now this part of the overview I'm kinda just gonna run over. So in 1972, Rutherford would be approached by Anthony in the pursuit of actually making a joint project together and creating an album together. And while Rutherford was definitely up for the task and he contributed a lot to it, seeing as Genesis was growing ever more popular at the time, he really didn't have a lot of time to dedicate to this project. And in the following years, Anthony would actually start recording more and more demo tapes of ideas that he had, as well as combining them with ideas he came up with pre or during his Genesis days, which ultimately led to 1974 when he would actually start picking pieces in order to form an entire album out of them. And when he finally had a good idea of the arrangement of all his demos and the structure of the final album, he would pitch the idea for this album to Charisma Records, who would actually give him an advance of £3,000 to actually start producing this entire album. And so amidst the recordings of Genesis The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Rutherford would sometimes come and help Anthony in recording this album of theirs, and seeing as the tour for said album was supposed to happen but then was delayed by a month because Steve Hackett injured his hand, they had an extra 3 months to actually work on the album together. And so the recording took place at a very steady pace, although there were some technical difficulties, but as I said in the beginning, I don't have the time to elaborate. And amongst some of the players on this album, we can actually find Anthony's brother called Rob, which plays the oboe on 2 separate tracks on here. And yet another player on here is no other than Steve Hackett's brother called John Hackett, who also plays the flute on here. Now John was actually practicing and learning the flute beforehand, but he didn't know if to pursue music as a career, and well, this opportunity given to him by Anthony Phillips actually kickstarted his own musical career. And in 1975, the recordings for this album would be moved to the Little Venice Studios in London, which were actually situated on a moving boat. And well, recording went pretty much like a smooth sail, although sometimes there would be difficulties because other boats would crash into the studio, which is a very peculiar kind of problem if you ask me. And yet another problem was the fact that they needed to record timpani parts, but the timpani themselves didn't even fit through the portholes on the boat, so they had to stretch a microphone cord all the way to them in order to record them. And in early 1976, the recording for this entire album was finished altogether, and Anthony came back to Charisma Records pitching his album yet again, and this time Charisma Records told him that they didn't want to release it, seeing as progressive rock was falling out of grace at a very quick pace. So Anthony approached the Virgin record label, and he unfortunately got the same response, and that persisted all the way up until 1977 when he was finally approached by the USA publisher of Passport Records, which decided that they would release his album in the USA. And combining that with the newly established record label of Tony Smith, the manager for Genesis, he would decide to publish this album in the UK, as well as Vertigo record labels deciding to publish this album in New Zealand, Japan and Argentina. But all in all, this album wasn't really that successful, and it didn't even manage to sell more than 10,000 copies, and it peaked only at the 191st place in the top Billboard 200s in the US. And honestly, I don't think that this is a bad album, just a fine album released at a very wrong time. And now, nearing almost 50 years since the release of this album, I do believe that this one has become some sort of a classic, looked upon next to other greats from Genesis as well as other Genesis members' solo albums. But in the punk rock era when this album was released, this album really didn't fit all that well. And personally, I am a bit split about this one, because on paper this album has everything that I would love about a piece of progressive music, but as it stands, this album is way more than just progressive, and it takes a lot of learnings from actual classical compositions, which are very different from the bombastic, grandiose, and right-in-your-face composition styles that we find on usual progressive rock. This album, it's constructed a bit oddly. The opener track is about a minute and a bit long, and it's a beautiful opening piece, but the fact of the matter is that it basically just fades in and fades out as soon as it came, as soon as it goes, and it doesn't even seamlessly flow into the next track. And the second track on this album is Which Way the Wind Blows, which is the one that Anthony wrote all the way back in 1970. And well, despite it being over 7 years since conception, this track sounds a lot like what you'd expect to find on early Genesis albums. And while it is a perfectly good song, I feel that in the context of this entirely very symphonic album, it just doesn't seem to fit. The third track, which is the Henry Suite, is actually my favorite from this entire album, but it's not without its flaws. I do find it to be a very compelling and interesting piece of music, and it's made out of 6 parts, which are unfortunately, as I said, very disjointed from one another, each one coming to a fade out before starting off the next one instead of just flowing into one another, and it just made me realize how well the seamless transitions on mainly these concept albums are so important. But yes, Anthony plays on here his beautiful 12-string guitars, which is something that would be found on the rest of this entire album, which I personally really love, but I do believe that a piece like this and this entire album as a whole is one that takes more than one listen to really get into. God If I Saw Her is yet one of those Genesis pieces, and honestly, I will say it again, it is a good piece, but it just doesn't have a place on this album. Chinese Mushroom Cloud is one of the oddest songs on this entire album, seeing as it is 46 seconds long, and I do believe that there's more time in which it fades in and out than actual instrumental piece in the middle of it. And the last 2 tracks on this album, I will honestly tell you, they are pretty forgotten on me. I know that they have a lot of Anthony on the guitar and stuff like that, but honestly, that's about all that I remember from them, and they've been quite of a lackluster and as a whole. And of course, I haven't touched yet on the title track, which is technically a 2-parter put into one song. Now this piece encapsulates everything that I should like but don't like about this album. On paper, it should be something that I would absolutely adore, but it just doesn't happen to be the case when I actually listen to it. This one is built, if I might make it even more simplistic, out of 4 build-ups, each one consisting of mainly 4 minutes of runtime, each one making this very gradual build-up that is very promising, and then resolving for like a few seconds before just coming to a complete stop and starting all over again, with the only exception being the last build-up, which actually goes somewhere. And you know, it was fine and dandy the first time, but honestly, afterwards it just kinda gets repetitive, boring, and not that special, and again has a lot of those classical influences in it, which for me right now just kind of sounds odd. And yeah, that's this album basically, and I will emphasize this is not a bad album, but a very interesting progressive album, which honestly to me feels very much out of touch with even the progressive world, which is by itself a very out of touch world with the rest of music as a whole. I love the 2 Genesis era tracks on here, they're really good, but as I said, they stick out like a sore thumb on here, and their place really doesn't belong on here. And this album also made me realize how important seamless transitions are to an album. This album comes through a plethora of times to complete stops, just nada, just no music, we're stopping the thing, and then we're continuing from there, and it honestly ruins every good momentum that this one should have, and it's honestly pretty sad. But as a whole, I do believe that this album is some sort of a very weird case of an album that probably grows on you in the passage of time, so I'll just have to keep you all updated seeing how I like this album in the future. So this beautiful cover would be painted by no other than Peter Cross, whom Anthony would actually acquire his skills due to his ability to paint English romanticism in a very pastoral way, which is definitely what we see on this one, and it also definitely very much fits the type of music on this album. I personally like everything about this album cover, I wouldn't really say that it's one of my all-time favorites, I just think that it looks very much good, and that's about all there is to it, and when it comes to representing the music, well, it does a pretty splendid job. So this album wasn't really a blast to listen to, at least not on the first listen, and I do believe that it will take time to really get into it, so for now it's gonna receive a very fine rating of 7 out of 10. But that's about it guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to A Curious Feeling by Tony Banks. Yes, I know, the coincidence. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.